There is a piece of ground so old that the names of fathers are planted in its soil, so sacred that a king's gold cannot change what God declared about it. What do you hold when all you have left is a field and a promise? What do you guard when the throne asks for more than a sale? When it demands the removal of an inheritance that binds a family to its God? In the green folds of Jezreel, beneath a wide sky that could be blue as blessing or iron as threat, Naboth's vineyard lay like a page of memory written in vine stems and stone terraces. The rows ran in gentle terraces down the slope, each furrow a date, each trellis a generation. There was a low altar tucked beneath an olive tree where the family came to give thanks at harvest. On that stone, someone had carved long ago the words every Israelite learned to honor. It is the Lord's inheritance, not a thing to be traded without the covenant's voice. The inscription had taken the weather and the years, and become as much a part of the land as the striations of its soil. Children learned their names there. The aged traced family lines against the rock and said them aloud, as if speaking the God of their fathers back into being. Naboth himself moved among the vines with the slow surety of a man who had never been in a hurry to be anyone but steward. His hands answered to soil. His speech answered to the altar. He kept the Sabbath seasons. He taught his sons to count the weeks between harvests, and he kept the memory of the law as if it were a living fence around his fields. When he stooped to prune, the wind would carry the olive-sweet breath of the hills and the cries of herds from the valley. He was a man whose identity was braided to that plot, inheritance in the fullest sense, as Deuteronomy and the statutes of the elders had taught. Land given from father to son, a family's covenant sign, not mere real estate to be bought into strangers' gardens. It was that very sense, the conviction that land carried covenantal weight, that turned a quiet corner in Naboth's life into a thunderstorm. Ahab was a king of palaces and appetite. He was not a ruler unknown to covetous desire. He walked a different geography, marble floors, distant banners, a court where taste was a kind of law. From his window he saw Naboth's vineyard sloping green, and the corner of that earth lodged in his chest like an unspent wish. He wanted a garden, open terraces, shade, a pleasure place to please himself and his guests. He wanted it enough to think the ask would be a quick thing. Give my steward the land, take my gold, make me happy. So his messenger came with a voice polished by royal favor and the king's smile. He brought an offer measured in silver and an offer of exchange that smoothed the idea of loss into a new name. Buy or swap, and have the king's pleasure. The steward's tongue promised comfort. Name your price, and you shall have it. It was an offer that could have been reasonable in any marketplace. Coin for land, contract for enjoyment. To a man like Naboth, it was an impossible question because the law had already answered it. The messenger returned with a quick face. He reported Naboth's answer as if surprised by a scandal. Naboth had stood at his hearth among his children and wife, and said plainly, rooted as a vine, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers." Those words fell like a hinge closing on the request. They were not negotiation, they were covenantal refusal. The law behind him, seen more clearly in the way he touched the altar stone and in the stories he had been told about God's gift to Israel, made the offer illegitimate. The land was not an object to be bartered away. It was a line in a family's story that only God could alter. To sell it would be to unweave a strand of the community's memory. News of that refusal moved through Jezreel like a sudden wind. At the king's house, the refusal was more than an answer. It felt like an affront. Ahab's appetite turned to a blunt thing. Wounded pride. Men who were used to people saying yes felt unreasonably entitled to the word. There at the palace, the smell of incense could not disguise the sourness of a monarch's petulant want. Ahab retreated to his inner rooms troubled and blank, the way men are when they expect obedience and find instead the mirror of conscience. He lay upon his bed, turned his face away, and there was a hollow anger in his silence. Into that hollow stepped Jezebel. She was not queen merely by marriage, she was queen by design. Where the king fretted in private, Jezebel took a ruler's decisive step. From her sheaf of scrolls and cunning, she drew diagrams of law and court, of persuasion and force. If a refusal could be endured in a private exchange, it could not remain if shaped into a public matter. So she penned words as sure as a legal argument, an accusation dressed in solemnity. She would give Naboth the semblance of due process. An assembly called, witnesses produced, verdict pronounced. She would make law look like law even as she set its gears to grind to her will. When Jezebel's letters went through town, they were stamped with the voice of the palace and delivered with a soldier's broad-shouldered certainty. She addressed the elders of Jezreel as if appealing to their duty, and she named the course she wanted taken. Find 2 men, accuse Naboth of cursing God and the king, bring them forward in the gate, convict him, and let stoning make the rest a matter of public record. She wrapped the plot in ritual, the very thing Naboth had bowed to, turning piety into a weapon. She understood that perverted religion could be made to look like righteousness if it had the right witnesses, the right tone, and the right men to stand before the gate. In the town square, the marketplace that had once been a place of barter, was where justice became theater. The elders of Jezreel, men like Azariah, respected for years, and names called in the exercise of law, found themselves in a strange position. Some were old men whose bones prized stability over truth. Some were ambitious and weary of courts and crowns. Among them was Joel, a neighbor of Naboth who had watched vine side by side with him since boyhood. Joel's face, familiar with 1,000 small mercies, was a place of conscience. Azariah's eyes were hard with calculation. He would later be remembered in the town only by his silence. Where Joel wanted truth, Azariah wanted safety and favor. False witnesses were found, men whose mouths were greased to tell the story the queen wanted. They spoke in the gate as if reading from a script, violent words about blasphemy and treachery. The crowd favored drama, accusations made for easy spectacle. Naboth was brought before the assembly, not as a man being heard, but as an example being produced. He stood before his neighbors, a man who had never been a revolutionary, who had only ever been a keeper of vows. He spoke then not with the tangled eloquence of the learned, but with the plainness of a man who knew what his fathers had said and what God had given. "Naboth," they said, "have you cursed God and the king?" "No," he answered simply. He could have argued, he could have wrestled for nuance, but he did not. His refusal had been made in the private circle of his family, and now it was called a public crime. He could hardly imagine that the same covenant that made his land holy could be used to take his life. When the sentence came, when the crowd, swayed by the false witnesses and the tone of the queen's demand, called for the penalty of stoning, Naboth's uprightness did not falter. He moved with the stoic clarity of a man who believed that faith, not survival, would define him. Before the first stone was thrown, he turned his face to the square, to the sky, and to the small altar he loved in memory. He spoke the prayer that was the breath of his people, the Shema. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." The words were a covenantal oath, heard then as both a confession and a claim, that the Lord remained sovereign even where men pretended rule. Reciting the Shema in that moment was not merely reciting scripture. It was staking his soul on the one God who names justice, even as men in the assembly tried to rename it. Stoning was not described there as a spectacle, but as a rupture, the community tearing itself. The stones fell not merely on Naboth's body, but on the town's conscience. His wife and sons watched, and the field where they had stored oil seemed suddenly a field of ashes. Joel could not find voice strong enough to challenge the crowd. Azariah, with the elders, let the process go through as if the stamp of authority made it right. Those who threw stones may have believed they acted for law. Others did it to be seen, to avoid the shame of refusing a queen's command. The noise of bodies hitting body was brief, but it laid a long hush over Jezreel. When the tumult ended, a silence spread that had nothing to do with peace. Naboth lay in his field, and in the air above the terraces there was a small, sharp presence, a promise violated. The altar still held the carved words, now bearing the blood of a family's witness. Naboth's kin gathered him with quiet hands, and wrapped him as families do, turning the simple rites of burial into an act of stubborn remembrance. They spoke of his name and his line, of how he had kept the covenant with a stubborn and holy refusal. In the small rooms where families sat together afterward, grief took the shape of questions. How could men confuse law with murder? How does a kingdom make itself a god? Meanwhile, the king put on the garment of possession. Ahab came to the vineyard, drew near to the wall that had once walled off his desire, and himself looked upon the land he had coveted. He moved into the space with a monarch's sway, as if the field would answer his hunger and change the taste of his wants. But possession had lost some of its color. The vines would grow, but the air around them bore the echo of what had been done. The joy that kings expect to find in taking what they want was muted by the knowledge that a man had died for a pleasure garden. And the city? It did not remain the same. Where justice had been perverted, trust frayed. The elders who had allowed the plot to be carried out kept their titles, but their moral currency had been diminished. Azariah wore his place in the assembly like a coin with a small, worn edge. Joel, neighbor to a grave, walked among the vines and felt the weight of his conscience. He could not speak as loudly as he wished. The queen's power and the fear of being marked kept many tongues still. But Joel's silence was troubled sleep, and the neighbors who had seen the trial would carry that sight into markets and homes and sermons. Stories breed in the corners of towns where sorrow sits. The name of Naboth would be spoken in whispers, in prayers at family altars, in the long afternoons of the olive press. Beyond human ears, a different kind of watching had taken place. The God who ordains covenants does not forget the sound of them being torn. The altar stone still bore the words, "Inheritance of the Lord," and God's memorial is not like human memory that dims. Divine remembrance is a memory that contains a promise of reckoning. In the corridors of heaven, perhaps, there was no haste. God's justice is measured by different clocks. For now in Jezreel, grief and guilt and the taste of stolen soil would settle like dust. But the story was not over. There are times when God waits, when a voice must rise that will not let the theft be merely a footnote. In the dark after the burial, neighbors gathered at small fires and little flames told as much as a court could, that the life of Naboth had been a witness, and that witness had cost everything. The family closed their doors, and the vineyard, though under new authority, looked as it always had. The same leaves, the same roots. But the air was different. Men who had been content to look away found themselves glancing at the king's palace with a new unease. The silence of the elders had been an accomplice. Every quieted conscience was another stone thrown in a courtroom of the heart. Word of the event spread beyond Jezreel's stones. In the hills and in the wilderness, men who listened for the voice of God heard the echoes and the questions. The story of a poor man who refused a king because of God's command trades in a different currency. It will, in time, shape the mouths of prophets. For now, it shaped the breath of Joel and the stiffness of the elders and the bitterness at the table of Naboth's sons. This is where the narrative presses on the skin, where the cost of faithfulness is counted in grief and graves. Naboth had chosen the altar over ease. He had preferred the commandment of God to the command of a monarch. He had kept his soul as his family kept its field. The result was a violent end, a household broken, and a city that could no longer imagine what justice looked like when power and religion conspired. And yet the land would not forget. The terrace walls would carry on. Vines would root and yield. Children would still run in the rows. Memory has a stubborn way of insisting on life. Those who had been left behind, his wife, his sons, would become the living archive of a man who chose covenant over life. They would teach their children the names of fathers, and in the telling, Naboth's refusal would become a lamp in dark places. There is a hardness to the world that squeezes out soft things, yet there is also a stubbornness in the faithful. A man can be stoned and yet leave behind an argument God will hear. The theft of a piece of ground, the turning of law into a tool of murder, and the shame of elders' silence, all of this amassed into a moral debt that is larger than any court's verdict. The question that hangs over Jezreel, is not whether the king has the land. He does. But what the taking cost, and who will speak for those costs. If this story matters to you, subscribe so you won't miss more Bible stories that anchor faith. In the days that followed, the vineyard looked like any other from a distance. From up close, it was a place where memory and mourning met. Ahab walked its borders and found no solace. Jezebel, who had engineered the change with a heart that treated covenant like a bargaining chip, moved on to her next exercise of power, for power tends to be its own hunger. The elders resumed their positions. Life in the town went forward as if continuity could heal everything. People began to whisper of what would not be fixed by human law. Some said it was merely the cost of ruling. Others, like Joel, knew the cost would travel further than anyone imagined. When night came and the lamps were dimmed, doors shut and voices softened to rumor. The altar stone waited, the carving still clear. Inheritance of the Lord. That stone had seen a man die defending a law older than the crown. It knew what a family had given up to keep covenant. In the silence of the fields, under a moon that always gives impartial light, the land kept its witness. And somewhere beyond the town, in the wide places where prophets sometimes make their paths, there were ears that heard that faith ensured nothing in this life, but was nevertheless the only thing that could make a man stand when kings demand compromise. The world measured gain differently than God. In a kingdom that could take life for a garden, a soul-preserving refusal would be remembered by those who measure by covenant rather than by crown. The story had been written in blood and in prayer, and though human courts had passed their sentence, the larger court that keeps accounts of covenant had begun to note the debt. So the first chapter closes with a body laid in the earth and a field taken by the powerful. The immediate consequence sits like a bruise over Jezreel, a moral climate altered, elders stained by silence, a neighbor's conscience unsettled. But the tale of Naboth was not merely one of a man lost to tyranny. It had become an emblem for the question every believer will meet at some point. What will you give for your inheritance, your place before God, when the world asks for that which God declared sacred? The next movement of the narrative will not be in the market or the palace, but in the lonely places where prophets listen. The song Naboth recited as stones fell, Shema, was not an empty sound. It lingered like a seed, and seeds planted in grief find strange ways to grow. What Jezreel had done with law would be answered by a different kind of authority. The silence of certain men had already begun to speak in the small rooms where widows cried and sons clenched their fists. The God who keeps covenants keeps also the memory of those who keep them. For now, the vines waited. The altar remained with its carved mandate, and in the hush of the hills, a wind stirred that seemed to carry the faint outline of a voice that would not be quieted, one who would not accept that injustice could stand uncalled. The moment of confrontation had not yet come, but the stage was set. A crown had taken what it wanted, a family had paid the price, and the world had watched. The next sound would be prophetic, and prophecy does not always begin in the courts of kings. It begins in the wilderness where God's messengers hear differently. The quiet that followed the death in Jezreel was not empty. It was expectant. Where a covenant had been violated, something larger than political reprisal was being set in motion. In the wide places beyond the town, where the wind moved without regard for palace walls, a prophet listened. Elijah was a man made by deserts and by the economy of little things. The taste of a dried fig, the sudden cool of a cave, the cadence of God's voice in the hush after thunder. He had no throne to warm and no titles to polish. He walked in the margins and heard God's accounts. When the story of Naboth reached him, of a man who chose covenant over comfort and paid the cost, Elijah did not file it among the many injustices of the day. He carried it like an ember, the kind of heat that makes one stand and speak. He came to the vineyard not as a guest but as an accuser carrying the ledger of heaven. The image of him approaching the king is not of trumpets and courts, but of a lone figure cutting across terraces, dust at his sandals, eyes steady. He found Ahab where the king had placed himself to taste enjoyment, in the very plot his appetite had acquired with murder. The king saw him, and his face for a flicker held the surprise of a man who has been interrupted by conscience. Elijah stopped by the king's side and spoke with a voice that had the weight of scripture. The question he posed was not rhetorically gentle. It rang like a mirror held to a face. "Have you killed and also taken possession?" The words pressed against the appetite and the law at the same time. They accused not merely an act, but the character that allowed the act to be done. Then Elijah spoke what he said he had heard from God. He announced that the kingdom of Ahab would suffer a wound rooted in what had been done in Jezreel. The language of the oracle was severe. The house of Ahab would be cut off. There would be no healing for Ahab's bloodshed. Dogs would devour Jezebel in the territory of Jezreel. Dogs would eat those who died in the city. The houses of those who supported the injustice would not stand. Elijah's words were not a personal vendetta. They carried the grammar of covenant judgment, an insistence that when God's ways are trampled, consequences follow according to the moral economy that governs covenant life. When the proclamation landed in the king's ears, something like fear and something like sorrow rose inside him. Ahab had appetite, but he also had a capacity for being moved. He put on sackcloth, the coarse cloth of penitence, and he fasted. His posture changed. The king who expected obedience found himself humbled. The visual of a monarch in sackcloth and ashes is powerful because it confounds every expectation. Power exposed as vulnerable. God, who measures the bent of hearts, listened. The prophet's word was not repealed, but its timing shifted in the face of a penitent king. In a move that has puzzled counselors and comforted some and troubled others, the immediate execution of the oracle was postponed. The decree remained. The moral account remained open. Yet the window of God's action adjusted in response to a change in the heart. Ahab's repentance did not nullify the fact that an innocent man had been murdered for covetous desire. It opened a narrow possibility for a temporal reprieve on the exact timing of the judgment. This interplay, prophecy, repentance, divine memory, sets before us a theological tightrope. God's justice is not a mechanical clock striking without relation to human hearts. It is a moral force that attends to both deed and disposition. The prophet had spoken. The king had humbled himself. The larger story would keep moving toward fulfillment, but in God's economy the posture of a ruler mattered. It did not change the moral fact, but it shifted the path by which that fact would be borne out. Time moved and court still met, but another arena of truth-telling would soon be rung. When the matter of Ahab's military ambitions turned to Ramoth-Gilead, a theater of war and of oracles, the stage would host a collision of prophets. Ahab craved victory there and pressed his prophets for good news. 400 prophets spoke with one mouth. "Go up, the Lord will give the king success." Their voices were the sound of one instrument played by a court that feared displeasing a monarch. But there was one voice that had not been invited to the chorus, Micaiah of Ramah. He was a prophet who did not flourish at courtly feasts. He was the kind of man who spoke when others found it safer to tell the palace what it wanted to hear. The council summoned him, and though the room was crowded with the king's flatterers, he did not bend his word to make the king comfortable. When Ahab asked Micaiah whether they should go to battle, Micaiah did not first fashion a speech to satisfy political prudence. He spoke with clarity. When the 400 prophesied victory, Micaiah declared that he had seen the Lord sitting on his throne and a host of heavenly ones about him. He described a vision in which God allowed a lying spirit to enter the mouths of those false prophets so that the king would be led astray. It was an astonishing claim that God, sovereign, permitted such a trial in order to seal the tragically stubborn path of a ruler who would not align his life with covenant truth. Micaiah's words were not a flourish of imagination. They were a pointed theological claim. God's ways and a ruler's stubbornness were interacting in the theater of history. Ahab did not like the diagnosis. Rather than heed it, he put Micaiah under guard. The court had already preferred a chorus that would sing of victory. The prophet who spoke truth, who risked ridicule and jail, became a prisoner for the sake of his testimony. Yet his words stood as calibration in the moral ledger. The heavenly scene he described would unfold when the political moment matured. The gamble of history is a strange thing. At Ramoth-Gilead, as battle raged, Ahab attempted to hide among his troops by dressing himself in battle garments that would keep him from being singled out. The field of war is messy, and the providence of small events often carries the weight of monumental meaning. An archer, whose arrow found its mark, did not know the moral scaffolding around him. He only released a shaft. It found Ahab through the armor and lodged him with a grievous wound. The king was brought back to the chariot, and in that enclosed place the drama of prophecy found its fulfillment. He would die from that wound. The detail Matthew of symbolism insists upon is not the gore, but the theological closure. Ahab was stretched upon his chariot, the blood of his life seeping out, and dogs licked his blood, an image that Solomon's scribes might later write about as proof that the oracle was complete. The dogs licking became a sign that the moral wound had been opened to public shame, in the language the prophet had used. The house that had taken Naboth's vineyard with wrongful hands was unraveling in the way Elijah had declared. The kingdom tasted the bitter fruit of justice mixed with mercy delayed. But the narrative did not stop at Ahab's death. The moral and political rot that had grown in the dynasty required a decisive pruning. Jehu becomes the instrument of that pruning. An army commander anointed by prophetic action, Jehu came with a single-mindedness that the court had not expected. Where Ahab had cultivated soft desire, and Jezebel had spun courtly legislation into lethal machinery, Jehu acted like an executioner of a higher legal code, the code that had been violated and that demanded correction. Jehu's sweep was not a private vengeance. It was framed as the enforcement of an old covenantal ethic, against a house that had corrupted worship into a tool of statecraft, and that had overseen idolatry and murder alike. His arrival in Jezreel was violent in the sense of political upheaval. Doors thrown open, soldiers cut down, courtiers seized. But the narrative insists that God's hand was in the outcome. The overthrow was not personal score settling. It was the undoing of a dynasty that had turned religion into a partner of power. When Jehu rode into Jezreel, Jezebel met her end in a way that the prophetic word had described. She was hurled from a window. The fall was the closing of a chapter in which a queen had used religious forms to justify personal ambition. Her death, and the report of dogs consuming her body, was recorded as the completion of the oracle that had been spoken at the vineyard. The imagery is stark. The proud woman who moved easily among Sibylline courts ended among the trampled stones. Yet the focus of the narrative is not prurient delight. It is the moral symmetry. The instrument of injustice that treated covenant like a bargaining chip came undone in a manner that fulfilled the prophetic calibration of consequence. What remains beyond the dramatic turn of bodies and crowns is the lingering moral ledger. Naboth's family would continue. His sons and wife would bury him and keep his memory. Joel, who had stood powerless in the square, found his conscience seared and admonished his own silence. In time, Jezreel's elders learned a different scar of governance. Authority that divorces itself from the demands of justice erodes legitimacy. The elders who had complied with Jezebel's plot kept their offices, but their moral capital was spent. Their names would carry a different weight in the telling of the story to future generations. Naboth's vineyard became a testimony in the earth. Where the terraces had once only been familiar to the family and to the villagers, they now stood as a testament about the cost of fidelity. A field can be a stubborn teacher. It outlives political regimes. It remembers the hands that planted the vines, and it knows the shape of seasons that kings cannot command. The inscription, "Inheritance of the Lord," carved into the altar stone, took on a new resonance. It no longer was merely an old rule. It became an accusation against every ruler who would imagine the authority to subvert covenant. And the moral geography extends beyond the immediate actors. The story is a mirror for communities. What do we do when the law of God collides with the law of the powerful? Who among us will say no? Who will stand when the world insists otherwise? The narrative keeps asking these questions through the lives of Joel and Azariah, through the prophet who listened in the desert, and through the false prophets in royal courts who chose applause over truth. There is also an important thread about the nature of prophetic speech itself. Elijah's oracle was brutal in tone because it confronted royal violence. Micaiah's word was unpopular because it exposed the palace's collusion with convenient visions. Yet these prophetic acts were not mere thunder. They were attempts to steer the moral arc of a people. Prophecy is both accusation and invitation. It accuses the present deformation and invites a return. When an Ahab puts on sackcloth, the prophet's job is not finished. It continues in the subtle winding of events that test if the heart has truly changed. How then does the modern ear hear this ancient chord? The point is not to manufacture parallel persecutions or to convert the story into blunt political allegory. The thrust is theological and moral. There is such a thing as an inheritance that cannot be bought, an inheritance that is bound up with covenant fidelity to God and to neighbor. When the marketplace and the palace see land and life as exchangeable commodities, they are committing sacrilege against a social memory that was intended to protect families, to ensure justice for the vulnerable, and to keep faith alive in ordinary acts. Naboth's courage, then, must be named not only by what he refused, but by what he affirmed. He affirmed a covenant that carried the names of fathers across generations. He refused the king because he refused, finally, to make his family's story a commodity. That refusal cost him life, but it preserved a witness that would echo to the ears of heaven and to the hearts of later prophets. It is the kind of courage that does not calculate outcomes as the first variable. It says yes to God, even when the world offers the highest of payments to say no. There is a dangerous tendency to read the sequence as a guarantee. Suffer, and the world will immediately correct itself. The narrative resists such simplistic theology. God's justice is not a vending machine that dispenses recompense at once. Sometimes there is a delay. Sometimes mercy meets judgment in strange ways. Sometimes repentance alters the timeline. Ahab's sackcloth moved the timetable, but did not wipe the ledger clean. Micaiah's imprisonment did not nullify his prophecy. Elijah's announcement was not the personal gloating of a man pleased by downfall. It was the faithful announcement of a covenantal ordinance. The story also throws a harsh light on silence. The elders who allowed the plot to proceed did not wield swords. They wielded an omission. Silence in the face of injustice is not neutral. It speaks a language of consent. Joel's shame is instructive. His conscience carried the weight of not having been louder. The moral lesson presses upon the listener. Complicity often wears the robes of caution. Yet caution is sometimes a moral failure when it preserves comfort at the cost of another's life. There is a pastoral tenderness here too. Naboth's family, broken as it was, did not disappear. The community's memory kept him, and those who loved him continued the work of stewardship over the fields. Their acts were small counter-accusations. They would name the fathers, they would trace the covenant lines. They would teach their children the Shema that Naboth had voiced at the gate. Those domestic acts, prayers at home, the naming of ancestors, became a quiet resistance to the palace's public power. For believers, the theological upshot is sober and galvanizing. Faithfulness has cost, historically and personally. It may cost family, land, reputation, even life. Yet the story of Naboth shows that what is lost to the world may be preserved before God. Divine memory is not a passive recollection. It is a promise that what is done in a covenantal register matters beyond immediate measurement. Justice in God's economy is not always immediate, but it is real. It reorients priorities in this life toward what will last in the next. That truth begets both consolation and exhortation. Consolation, because the believer is not abandoned in the calculation. What is done in faith is registered in a ledger God keeps. Exhortation, because the story indicts the comfortable and announces that some goods cannot be traded. It calls communities to cultivate the courage to speak truth to power, to refuse the complicity of silence, and to protect the small altars and inscriptions that anchor a people to covenant. There is a particular pastoral moment when the narrator must point a finger not in accusation, but in invitation. If you stand in your vineyard today, whether that be a literal plot of land, a marriage, an office, a ministry, or a conscience, consider what is being asked of you. Will you barter the inheritance of your fathers, your ethical memory, your fidelity to God, for a small, immediate joy? Will you allow ritual to be weaponized by power? Will you be like Joel, whose conscience would carry the burden of silence, or like Naboth, who chose a costly refusal? Courage does not always look like heroics. Often it looks like a slow, steady refusal to normalize injustice. It looks like families keeping their prayers and names at evening tables. It looks like prophets who speak in deserts and are willing to be mocked or imprisoned for telling truth. Courage can look like sackcloth, not for display but as a sign that even kings can repent. Courage is also communal. Elders must learn to hear the altar's inscription, and not to mistake the voice of the palace for the voice of God. And yet there is room for a sober realism. Refusal to wince at the cost does not mean a flippant embrace of suffering. The narrative does not glamorize martyrdom. It honors the stubbornness of faith and laments the wrong that produces death. The story refuses both the cheap triumphalism that reads suffering as automatic vindication and the cynical despair that thinks silence safe. There is another layer to consider: the long-term consequence of perverting religion to serve power. Ahab and Jezebel did not simply lose a vineyard. They eroded the moral fabric that sustains a polity. Once worship is repurposed to sanctify ambition, trust collapses. The elders' silence was a symptom and a cause. When civic structures are enlisted to serve private appetite, the civic order decays. Jehu's violent correction was not an ideal remedy. It was the desperate work of uprooting a deep rot. The narrative warns communities everywhere. If the institutions that mediate God's presence are co-opted by power, the whole society suffers. In the quiet after the dust settled, Naboth's name became a small but persistent lamp. His refusal was not a political treatise, but a moral stance. It reminded those who heard it that some inheritances are not a line on a ledger, but a line in a story that binds a people to God. The vineyard, the altar, the carved words, they remained. They spoke to those willing to listen. The earth itself thereby testified against those who had turned religion into an instrument of appetite. If you walk through your town or your church or your workplace and sense an altar being repurposed to justify an appetite, remember Naboth. Remember the prayer he spoke as stones fell, the Shema ringing like a final claim. Remember Elijah's question asked at the edge of a property he did not own. Remember Micaiah, who refused to be silenced. Remember that the moral ledger is kept, even when human ledgers look the other way. There is a final mercy in this story that comforted the family long after the crowns had crumbled. God remembers. That is not a legalistic formula. It is an ethical assurance. To remember is to promise. God's memory does not erase suffering, but it ensures that suffering has weight and consequence in the moral calculus of history. Justice may follow slowly, and sometimes it follows through strange instruments, but it does follow. So what is the cost of courage? For Naboth it was life. For those who speak after him, the cost may be lesser or greater. For some it will be merely the scorn of a crowd. For others it will be exile or worse. But the cost of silence, the story insists, is immediate and communal. The corruption of institutions, the erosion of trust, the normalizing of theft. Courage, for the believer, is a posture that asks whether the soul will be preserved at the expense of everything else. The vineyard stands as proof that one man's refusal can matter. A king's gold cannot buy the names carved into a family's memory. The divine memory that attends covenant cannot be bribed. Naboth's courage shaped destinies and set in motion a moral reckoning that would consume a dynasty. It is a hard lesson about the cost of faithfulness and the way justice operates in a world that resists it. Naboth's courage, defying injustice even when it means death, that is not an invitation to seek suffering, nor is it an assurance that God's reckoning will always fall swiftly. It is, however, an insistence that some things are worth more than life as the world counts it. It is a call to bear witness with stubborn fidelity, to refuse the smoothing of conscience by power, and to keep the small altars, literal or symbolic, that remind us whose we are. If Naboth's courage moved you, share this with someone who needs to hear it.